Well, welcome to the book of Jeremiah. This is going to be another fun book for us to study. So let's talk a little bit more about Jeremiah himself. So if we start in Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 1, he says the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests that were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. So there's a lot of background information about where does Jeremiah come from and who he is. So when we look at this, there is a article by, let's see, who did this? It's kind of a long article from Kent Brown, The History of Jeremiah's Faith Crisis. Gives us a lot. Oh, there's actually a few different sections in here. Gives us a lot of information about Jeremiah's life. Let me get back up to the top of this. Okay. So let's think about Jeremiah the man now. So he was born into a priestly family at Anathoth. We know that because Hilkiah was one of the priests that was told by Josiah the king, remember, clean the temple. And then they found it. They think there is a possibility that Hilkiah, basically Jeremiah's dad, could have been the one that found or be a part of that cleanup that found the ancient scrolls, the old teachings that Josiah used to do his reforms with. Maybe. But Anathoth is a city that was set aside for priests to live in. If you remember back in the more Old Testament times with Moses and them, there were certain cities that the priests lived in, basically, and that Anathoth would be one of those in the area of land of Benjamin. So that tells you he's north of Jerusalem, basically, is where the tribe of Benjamin ended up settling. If you remember, they kind of didn't end up taking a lot of their land. They kind of let the Canaanitish people that were there live there. Didn't really take it all over and do well. So Benjamin got tossed around. And also you remember that the tribe of Benjamin nearly was wiped out in civil war a couple centuries before this, basically. So there's a lot of things that, for us to think about of what was the background of Jeremiah's life. So his father was a certain Hilkiah, and though proof is lacking, may have been descended from the line of Abiathar, one of David's priests who fell into disfavor in Solomon's day. So Abiathar himself was the descendant of Eli, who cared for the ark at Shiloh in the days before the monarchy. It is possible that the interest of Jeremiah in the shrine at Shiloh and its fate stems from this ancient family connection with that town. The date of Jeremiah's birth is a matter of dispute simply because of a certain obscurity attaching to the enigmatic words in chapter 1, verse 2, the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, which is given as the date of his call. So if we look in verse 2, it says, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. So Josiah's been in power for 13 years. He's already moving forward with these initiatives, these reforms, and then during that time is when God starts to speak to Jeremiah. So this is the beginning of his call, but how old was Jeremiah when he got his call, and what does that mean about his birth date if we work backwards? So if we think about this, Josiah began his reign in 640 BC, so that the 13th year of his reign was 627 BC. In the opinion of most scholars, this is the date when Jeremiah, described as a youth, began his public ministry. Assuming he was then 16 to 18 years of age, his birth would have been just before 640 BC. That is, just at the close of the reign of the notorious Manasseh. We are in complete ignorance about Jeremiah's childhood, but in view of his later ministry, we may conjecture that he was carefully trained in the great traditions of Israel's faith and history. So coming from a priestly family, he has more of a history steeped in the traditional old ways of doing things, of the sacrifices and what we should be doing at the temple. So he's contrasting what Israel is doing with what he has been taught we used to do. Because of his upbringing, he's closer to the old tradition, but he can see those differences. So he seems to have become familiar with many of the great stories of the past and to have been introduced to the sayings of earlier prophets, notably Hosea, who greatly influenced his early preaching in particular, both in language and thought. So there's a lot of things in the book of Jeremiah that are very similar to what's in the book of Hosea. But realize Hosea, even though it's going to be a couple months before we talk about Hosea, as far as in the Old Testament, Hosea was a prophet during the northern kingdom times in early Isaiah timeframes. So Hosea kind of predates Isaiah a little bit. They overlap quite a bit. But this is much longer, earlier times. So Jeremiah is probably reading what Hosea wrote, and that made an impression on him. And so he's using some of Hosea's writings or concepts in his own teachings as well. Now, when we look at this, in addition to his training, we must recognize his own sensitive nature and clear response to Yahweh. With such a traditional and conservative background, he must have begun to form convictions at an early age about the pagan practices which he found all around him, even the temple itself. Jeremiah, like Isaiah and Ezekiel and others, entered upon his work following a definite experience of a call. This was 627 BC. So Ashurbanipal died that year after a long reign, and the collapse of Assyria began at once. In 609, Assyria was to have vanished forever. Nabopolassar, the Chaldean prince, seized Babylon from the Assyrians in 626, could not be dislodged. Assyria's successor was already in place in less than 20 years, was to occupy Assyria domains as far as the borders of Egypt. Like Moses, Jeremiah sought to escape from Yahweh's call. We're going to find that Jeremiah wasn't excited that he was called as a prophet. He was like Moses, if you remember. Moses tried to argue with God and get out of it. Like, why me? I'm terrible. I'm an idiot. I can't do this. Jeremiah was similar in that sense. Perhaps he sensed the cost such a calling might involve. Only the assurance of divine aid made him accept the call. In Jeremiah's very early days as a preacher, Manasseh's evil influence was still being felt, and Josiah's reforms had hardly begun. The youthful preacher spoke vividly about the paganism, the apostasy, and the sheer ingratitude of the people to Yahweh. One of Jeremiah's deep concerns in these years was the gross ingratitude of the people, the like of which was unknown among pagan nations, and contrary to nature. Judah had pursued these strange gods while the burning passion of a wild ass in heat, with the burning passion. We're going to see more of that. The nation was stained so deeply that nothing could erase the stain. During these years, Josiah's reforms pressed ahead. It began when the king was in the 12th year of his reign. That's about 629 BC. What Jeremiah's attitude was to the reform is by no means clear. He could hardly not approve of official measures which brought an end to pagan cult centers and undertook important measures in the administration of justice, although it would seem unlikely that he took any particular part in the reform. So that's the challenges. I mean, Jeremiah is trying to tell the people, you need to repent and go back to Yahweh, back to God. And Josiah, the king at the time, wants people to go back to God, but he's trying to legislate it. Jeremiah is trying to get him to spiritually follow him, which is repentance. So Josiah is taking a more, I'm going to make it the law of the land to follow this God. And Isaiah is trying to say, you need to make the choice yourself to repent. So two different ways of getting to that same results, basically. And unfortunately, we're going to find, of course, Josiah, once he dies, it all goes back, like immediately back. So that's one of the problems that we're going to run into. Jeremiah has a crazy, crazy life. All kinds of things are going on with him. Again, he's during the time of a doomsday period, so not a good time to be around, basically. Yeah, a lot of change, a lot of tumult. Now, until about 70 years ago, virtually all scholars believed that, so there's a story at the beginning of Jeremiah's reign where he's talking about being conquered from the north. And then there's a group of Scythians, the horse riders that come down the coastline of the Mediterranean past Palestine. And they come down to go towards Egypt. And everybody's like, oh my gosh, they're going to come after us. This is Jeremiah prophesying. And then they go right by him. And they're like, oh, never mind. Jeremiah's a false prophet. And so this was early on in Jeremiah's life. And so I think that increased the doubt and questions about him as well. But they're not sure about the Scythians, if most scholars believe that was the Scythians that did that. But there's all kinds of stuff that we're going to learn about Jeremiah, basically. Hard time. All right, so let's jump in and continue on more from this. So verse 3, and you're going to see a bit of a jump here. It came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, unto the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, unto the carrying away of Jerusalem captive in the 5th month. So verse 3 kind of tells us this is when Jeremiah's ministry kind of ends. It kind of goes to this point and then kind of stops. So it begins in the 13th year of Josiah's reign, stops in the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign. So that kind of gives us this full perspective, basically, of where we are at with his time frames. So all during the Babylonian destruction. So Babylon comes in early in Jeremiah's time to occupy the area, and then there's 2 conquests that Babylon does against Israel, basically, or Judah at the time also. So he's there for all of those. In 612 BC, I think I read this part already. So what we're going to see is what happens in this time frame. There's between Josiah eventually dies, and then we have Jehoiakim, his son, and then Jehoiakim is there when Babylon comes in, and then he becomes a vassal state to Babylon, but then Babylon doesn't like him, and so they actually take Jehoahaz out, basically make them in exile at some point, and they change up the leadership to Zedekiah, and so then Zedekiah takes over. There's a lot of change. Just be aware of that. We'll try to make sense of it as we go, but a lot of change. So verse 4, then the word of the Lord came unto me, saying. So now we've kind of got some context here. This is now getting into some of the prophecy of Jeremiah. He says, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee. And I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. So this is talking about the call of Jeremiah to be a prophet. So Jeremiah is getting a revelation from God, and God is saying, I've known you longer than you've been alive. Basically, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. So this is interesting to think about. Some people wonder, is there a pre-existence? Did we live before we became mortal, before we were born into this mortal world? According to Jeremiah 1:5, that is a possibility, to have a pre-existence. Jeremiah was something before. Maybe he was, if you think of LDS philosophy, that would be a spirit child of God in heaven who would then come down and gain a body and go through this life existence, basically, through that plan of salvation. But this is definitely giving us that idea that God knew who Jeremiah was and appointed him to his role as the prophet of this time before he was mortal, basically. He was being prepared for this. Now, the Hebrew word in here is yada, which is translated knew. That's what it says, I knew thee. Okay? So this connotes a very personal and intimate relationship. So if you look at the New National Commentary of the Old Testament, that's how they talk about this. So the word knew is the Hebrew word yada, which not just means, yeah, I know who that person is, but I really know them. They're my friend, kind of knowing, basically. So that's, God really knew, he was really closely and intimately aware of Jeremiah before he was even born. So again, that leads us to this idea that there is a possibility of a pre-existence. We lived with God before we came to this earth. And that's a good, Jeremiah 1:5 is a good example of that. Now, he was ordained a prophet to the nations as well. So this is kind of, if you think about it, this is God going, I know you and have prepared you for this time period. That's probably reassuring to Isaiah or to Jeremiah. I mean, you got to imagine, oh my gosh, God is speaking to me. That's got to be a powerful experience by itself. And then God saying, look, I know you. You're part of my plan. This is going to be okay. I'm here to guide you. I'm here to help you out. We've got this. You are prepared for this time period. That's hopefully reassuring to him. I know that kind of reassured me a little bit to know, okay, God knows what he's doing. And in verse 6, in fact, then said I, Ah, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a child. Now, what this is really interesting because this is kind of Jeremiah trying to get out of being a prophet, like Moses, in fact. If you remember when God called Moses to the ministry, Moses said, I can't do this. One, Pharaoh hates me. I'm exiled out of Egypt. I can't go back. Legally, I can't go back without getting into trouble. Two, I have a speech impediment. I'm slow of speech. I can't talk properly. And God said, doesn't matter. I'm going to do a great work through you. So Jeremiah is going, I'm just a kid. I'm just young. I'm uneducated. I don't know everything. There's way smarter people around me. Why me? Why are you picking me? And so Jeremiah is in that same or a similar situation, basically. He's like, why? I'm not the best at anything. Why are you picking me? In verse 7, but the Lord said unto me, say not, I am a child, for thou shalt go to all that I shall send thee, and whatsoever I command thee, thou shalt speak. So again, reassuring him, saying, it's not you that are going to do the work. I'm going to tell you what to do. I'm going to tell you what to say. You just got to go do it. I'm going to make it easy for you. In fact, verse 8, be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee to deliver thee, saith the Lord. Then the Lord put forth his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said unto me, behold, I have put my words in thy mouth. Now, the Old Testament study manual had this to say about verse 9. It says in Jeremiah 1:9, the role of a prophet is succinctly set forth. A prophet does not necessarily say what he wants to say, for the Lord puts his own words into the mouth of the prophet. That is why it does not matter whether the word of God comes from directly from God or through his servant. It is the same, basically. So that's a good thing for us to realize is once we know this person is a prophet, then we realize that what they're telling us is coming from God. Maybe not everything they're telling us is coming from God, because sometimes they could share their own opinion on things. But when they say this is coming from God, we can be assured that is coming from God. Once we understand that they are a true prophet, basically, we test them. And we're going to learn about that, actually. We can see a lot of contrast of what makes a true prophet and a false prophet in this book of Jeremiah. It's going to be really fun. Verse 10, see, I have this day set thee over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out, to pull down, and to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant. Now, this is really interesting. So when you think about this, Jeremiah is to tear down the old wicked ways and build up the new righteous ways. So there's some of this language is to destroy, to root out, pull, like when you're pulling weeds out, to pull down, to take like a wall and pull it down, to destroy and throw down, basically take stuff apart, break it up, throw it to the ground, smash it, destroy it. So Jeremiah is being sent to take what is established and convince the people it's got to go away. We've got to just trash what we're doing now and start over, and then help them to build and to plant, to create something new out of the destruction, basically. That's his job. And that's really what a prophet's job is to say, that's not the way, this is the way. Go away from that, go this direction. That's what a prophet does. That's part of their call. So verse 11, moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Jeremiah, what seest thou? And I said, I see a rod of an almond tree. So this is part of Jeremiah's vision. Now this is interesting to think about. An almond branch was evidently chosen because it is the first tree to bud in spring. As the almond tree hastens to come into blossom, so would the word of the Lord through Jeremiah hasten to fulfillment. The Old Testament study manual said that. So almond buds come on first. This is the beginning of the growing season, the beginning of spring, the new life season, basically. So that's the symbol that Jeremiah is seeing, is he is the beginning of an opportunity for new life for Israel. Now, the beauty is the real, I mean, when you look at the whole book of Jeremiah, when you go back through it, basically it comes down to you guys are going to be returning to God at some point. Do you want to do it the easy way or the hard way? The easy way is repent. It's the hard way personally. Individually, it's the hard way because you have to make change. You have to admit you're wrong and change yourself. But it's easier than going through the destruction and conquest and decades of exile and destruction and other problems. But the choice between your no matter which way you go, it's all going to come back to the same point. Eventually, you're coming back to Christ. He's promised to restore you and work with you and bring the gathering of Israel now that they're starting to be scattered. Or the northern kingdom, which are 10 of the 12 tribes, is gone. Judah and Benjamin stayed around Jerusalem. They're the last two tribes. They're the last two to be scattered. So they could stay if they repent. If they don't, they'll be scattered and then gathered eventually down the road, which is the last days, our time now, basically. That was their choice. That's mainly what Jeremiah was sent to do, is say, here's your choice. You pick it. And we know which choice they picked. They went the hard way. Now, Anathoth is interesting too, because that plays in with this metaphor of the almond tree. You see, Anathoth remains, and Thompson brings this up in his book of Jeremiah. He says, Anathoth remains to this day a center for almond growing. The modern visitor to the area in the very early spring is promised the memorable and unforgettable sight of almond trees in bloom and in great profusion around the village of Anata. So not only is the almond being seen as the beginning of spring, the beginning of a new life, new harvest, new opportunities for Israel, or for Judah, I should say, but this is a metaphor that Jeremiah would be familiar with. You know, I love that when God is teaching his prophets and his people, he's using metaphors, he's using things that match for them. He's going into their way of perceiving things and going, let me explain my gospel through the way that makes sense for you. And he puts them into words and symbols that make sense to them, to bring it into them. That's so cool. Very powerful message for the rest of us in teaching as well. Now, verse 12, then the Lord said unto me, thou hast well seen, for I will hasten my word to perform it. Now, Thompson said it was Yahweh's assurance that promise that he was watching over his word proclaimed by Jeremiah to bring it to pass. Perhaps there was a further overtone as neatly conveyed in the NAB version of the Bible saying, I am early on the watch to carry out my purpose. So he's ahead of time. He's ahead of schedule, watching and observing and preparing for what needs to happen or what is coming. Yahweh would be prompt to fulfill his word as Jeremiah declared it. Just as the early bursting into leaf and bloom of the almond tree heralded the springtime, so the spoken word pointed to its own rapid fulfillment. That's really cool. Really cool thing that we get to see there. Now, verse 13, and the word of the Lord came unto me the second time. So this could be another revelation that Jeremiah got, saying, what seest thou? And I said, I see a seething pot. Now, this could have been the same vision, just a different metaphor now. It could have been a separate revelation that he's seeing now. It doesn't really matter which way we think about it, honestly. But he sees a seething pot, and the face thereof is toward the north. That's important. So the Kyle and Delich in their commentary on the Old Testament said the vision of a seething pot was shown to Jeremiah, symbolizing the disaster and pain which, like the contents of a boiling cauldron, would spill over and run down the kingdoms of the north to overwhelm Judah. So he's seeing this seething pot, meaning it's boiling, bubbling up. A lot of activity, a lot of tumultuousness, a lot of heat and intensity in it. And this pot is there, and then it's pointing towards, it's set north of Jerusalem, coming towards them. So if you tip the pot over, boiling, hot, intense water coming towards Jerusalem from the north. So a good representation of the kingdom from the north, Babylon, marching in like a flood, just wiping everything out, and Judah had no chance of warning, basically. They did have some warning, but not enough. They didn't do a good job. Now, verse 14, he says, Then the Lord said unto me, Out of the north an evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. So that's this, again, the northern kingdom coming down. Now, some people wonder, why the north? Why couldn't they have come from the east? Because that's kind of where Babylon was originally. So you have to realize the geography of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem kind of sits on a peninsula, sort of. They're surrounded on three sides by valleys, okay, like Kidron Valley and the Valley of Hinnom and them, where sacrifices were given to Molech and those things. So the east, the south, and the west had basically valleys around them. So the north was the easiest way in. You just kind of came out of the mountains and down into that area, and then there it was. And then there was valleys around Jerusalem to the other sides. So when you're in an army, you don't want to attack by going down into a valley and then have to run uphill to get to the city. You're going to, one, run out of a lot of steam getting up there, and two, that run up there is a great opportunity for whatever people are at the top to attack you, basically. So same concept as the high ground. If you think about that from a military standpoint, or even a Star Wars metaphor, Star Wars standpoint, when you get the high ground, you have a strong defense. So the best way to go after Jerusalem is to actually attack from the north, where it's more of a flat plains area in the hills coming down. You're kind of coming down to Jerusalem if you go that way. So that's a little easier to come in that way. Not to mention Babylon wasn't just over to the east. Babylon was occupying all of Assyria. So their army was everywhere across the whole nation, and then it would just come down into Jerusalem from that direction, basically. So to go into verse 14 a little bit more to look at this, Thompson said, It was a scene which Jeremiah might have witnessed any day in his village at Anathoth. And remember, Anathoth is north of Jerusalem, so he understands this idea of being in the north end of Jerusalem and coming from this direction. The explanation of the simple visual impression was that just as the boiling liquid boiled over in a southerly direction, so disaster would be let loose from the north. The full significance of that may not have been clear at once. If Jeremiah began preaching in 627 BC, the meaning must have been rather ill-defined. Many of Israel's troubles had originally come from the north over the centuries, from the Philistines, the Assyrians, and the Armenians. The north was a symbol for dark powers, often of uncertain origin. If, however, Jeremiah did not begin to preach till right at the end of Josiah's reign, the foe from the north was already identified as Babylon, basically. Now, a couple other, again, this is that we talked about a little bit earlier about this idea of the Scythians, the horsemen. They actually came down from the north along the coastlines and bypassed Judah, basically, and went down to Egypt to do some fighting. So when Jeremiah starts to preach this, that was kind of like, oh, is that it? I don't know. So it's a good reminder for us that sometimes when we are interpreting or trying to apply prophetic teachings, sometimes prophetic teachings can be applied more than once, and sometimes prophetic teachings are misapplied. Sometimes things happen and we think that could fulfill the prophecy, but it doesn't. Because the Scythians didn't march into Judah. They didn't march across the area and destroy him like a flood. They stayed to the side and went down the Mediterranean coast, basically. So that's the challenge. Now, in this, Kent Brown, in his article, History of Jeremiah's Faith Crisis, said that Herodotus, which was a Greek historian, says that the Scythians, after becoming masters of Asia, marched south intending to invade Egypt. En route, they passed along the coastline of Syria and Palestine, a movement which surely was known to the inhabitants of Judah and would have spread alarm. Arriving at the border of Egypt between the Philistine kingdom and the Delta region, the Scythians were met by Pharaoh Psammetichus and were bribed with gifts and persuaded not to invade the Nile Valley. So that gives you an idea of how confident Egypt was in their warring. So this was at a time where Egypt was no longer a world power. If you remember in the book of Isaiah, part of Isaiah's prophecies is God telling telling the northern kingdoms, don't listen to Egypt. They claim they'll come help you, but they are fake. They are not the power they used to be. They're a shell of their old power. And so this proves it. When the Scythians come down, and instead of fighting the Scythians, they bribe the Scythians to not invade them, basically. The Scythians then retraced their steps, plundering at least the Philistine city of Ashkelon. Incidentally, this second sweep past the outlying communities of Judah would also have been known in Jerusalem. After returning to Asia, the Scythians were said to have ruled for 28 years before their power waned. Herodotus' major interest centered on the possible relation of Aphrodite to the goddess of Ashkelon, whose city was attacked. But Herodotus' interest in Aphrodite does not call the historicity of the entire incident into question, neither is there any reason to suppose that the priests at Ashkelon made up the story merely to entertain the inquisitive visitors to their city. And in the Bible, he says, moreover, the fact that the Bible doesn't make any specific mention of this incident and that it was narrated by Herodotus alone does not destroy his credibility in the least. But it's hard to believe him. So Herodotus was known for embellishing some of the historical stories. We read Herodotus and we're like, wow, this is amazing stuff. And then we'd read other people and went, okay, Herodotus kind of made a bigger deal about it than the other people did. So maybe Herodotus is not 100% accurate. There's still a lot of subjectiveness in his writings. And this is an area where they kind of go back and forth and say, well, we're not sure, but it could be that. But so the challenge is again, for Jeremiah, if he thinks and the people interpret his prophecy as the Scythians, nothing happened. So you could either say, well, either we misapplied the prophetic teaching or the prophet is false. Now, most of the time when this kind of a conundrum comes up for people, they choose what sides the most with their own opinion. So to say Jeremiah is a false prophet is way easier than saying he's a true prophet, but maybe I'm mistaken in how I'm applying this prophecy. Maybe the Scythians is not how this prophecy is applied. But that means I have to change my opinion. So it's much easier to say Jeremiah is wrong than to say I am wrong. This is pride. This is a big problem that we have to get rid of in our religious societies because it is stopping us from growing and improving, basically, in our spirituality. We need to realize that everything we know is not the whole truth. There's still more to be learned, and there's a good chance at least half of what we know right now should be thrown away, and we need to learn more. So realize everything you know about religion and about God, half of it should probably be tossed out the window, and you need to learn more about how to gain that relationship with God more. It's which half you got to throw out, I don't know. That's where you have to decide to be willing to say, where am I right, where am I wrong, and admit that all of it could be wrong, and that'll help you to find what is right and find the truth. It's Alma chapter 32, by the way. So verse 15, for lo, I will call all the families of the kingdoms of the north, saith the Lord, and they shall come, and they shall set every one his throne at the entering of the gates of Jerusalem, and against all the walls thereof round about, and against all the cities of Jerusalem. So this is okay, I'm going to call the families of the kingdoms of the north, so plural, and they're going to come down, and they're going to lay siege to Jerusalem, basically. They're going to set up their camps around you. So Thompson says in his book of Jeremiah, the setting up of thrones at the gates of Jerusalem would be a symbol of conquest and subsequent rule over the land. Such a prophecy would have provoked great resentment in Jerusalem at any time during Jeremiah's ministry, even after the fall of Jerusalem in 597 BC. There were many who could not accept the rule of the Babylonians. Even after 586 BC, when the position had become absolutely clear, there were many who regarded it as only a temporary setback. These people were stubborn about their beliefs, very stubborn. And we're going to see that play out. There's there is so many lessons for us to learn in our modern day from the book of Jeremiah. It's amazing. So I'm glad you're here watching these videos, especially if you've made it this far in this one, because this has gone a little long with the introduction and everything else. Verse 16, and I will utter my judgments against them, touching all their wickedness, who have forsaken me, and have burned incense unto other gods, and worshipped the works of their own hands. So now you realize that burning of incense is a symbol of prayer. This is if you think back to the time of Moses, they would put incense in the Holy of Holies as like a prayers up to God. They were made. There was a symbol of the people praying to God. But what's interesting, Old Testament Study Manual said the burning of incense is a symbol of prayer, far more implied in the Lord's accusation than just a ritual of burning incense to false gods. The people were seeking help and guidance from the false gods rather than from the Lord. So they're praying to the gods. They're using incense and helping to pray to the gods, the false gods. So they are not following the true religion. They're following a more Canaanitish version of Israelite religion, basically. So verse 17, thou therefore gird up thy loins and arise and speak unto them all that I may command thee. Be not dismayed at their faces, lest I confound thee before them. So verse 17 is again a powerful look. Gird up your loins. Now, girding up your loins, we learned this in the past, in past videos, girding up your loins, because in these ancient days, robes is what they wore. They didn't have pants. They wore robes. The problem is just like any woman can tell you, running in a dress is hard because the material constricts the movement of your legs, basically. So you can only go you can only move your legs so far apart. So your gait is not very big, and that slows you down. So what they would do back then is you would reach down underneath your front robe, grab the back robe, and you would pull it forward. So as you lift your garment up to your knees, pull the back of your robe up over the front of the robe, basically up in front of you, and you would hold it there. So you kind of made it look like you were wearing pants. You changed from a robe into something that looked like a split skirt or pants, basically. And then that's how you could run, is by holding the back of your robe in front of you, and so it kept it lifted up to your knees and held it up so it wasn't constricting your gait, so you could run faster. So gird up your loins is prepare for a race, prepare for a lot of work to do, some toil coming, basically. And so God is telling him, get ready, and I need you to go speak. And if you don't, I will confound you, basically. I will not let you speak the truth, and no one's going to believe you. So verse 17, you got to admit, 17 would be a little like, oh, okay, God means business here. Wow, okay. Verse 18, for behold, I have made thee this day a defenced city, and an iron pillar, and brazen walls against the whole land. Now this is military language. A defenced city, an iron pillar, brazen walls. Basically, he is using military terms to tell Jeremiah, I'm protecting you, basically. He says, I'm going to put you up against the kings of Judah, against the princes thereof, and against the priests thereof, and against the people of the land. So there's three groups mentioned there. There's government, which is your king and your princes. There's religious leaders, those are the priests, and then there's the people, basically. You're going to be against all three of them, and I'm going to protect you. So God is basically telling him in verse 18, Jeremiah, I got your back. I'll be your protection. I'm here to protect you. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of you. And now verse 19, of course, and they shall fight against thee, but they shall not prevail against thee, for I am with thee, saith the Lord, to deliver thee. So when they talk about they, of course, we're talking about these three groups. The people are going to fight against him sometimes, and we're going to see that. He actually had his family tried to kill him, tried to actually have him assassinated. The priests won't like him. They try to get him killed. And the government definitely doesn't like him, and they try to get him executed as well for treason and things. And so it's interesting because these are people that should have been able to help Jeremiah, but they didn't. None of them did, basically. They're all against him, which is verse 19 pretty much, verse 19 does not do justice to the problems and challenges that Jeremiah is about to face. It kind of summarizes them all together in one succinct sentence, but doesn't give you the depth of what Jeremiah is about to go through in his life and ministry. So God technically prophesied basically Jeremiah's whole life in this revelation he's getting, but didn't give him any of the details of it. That'll come later. And God does that. He tells us to do something, but doesn't give us the details of why. And so it's kind of an interesting thing. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the book of Jeremiah in chapter 1. Let's jump over to chapter 2 as we continue to understand what was really going on at the time of Jeremiah's life with Judah and Babylon, the wickedness and the symbology it gives for the last days, for our day. There's so much that's applicable to our day and age. It's amazing. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video.